My name is E.J. Kwandibens. I'm a Indigenous cultural educator, and my traditional name is Anekegijik, and I come from the Loon clan, otherwise known as Mang Dotem. My First Nation is White Sand First Nation. It translates to Wabidanga First Nation, which is located approximately 21 hours northwest of the city of Toronto in Ontario. My relationship to the Church Street community is something that has transpired over approximately 22 years. I moved to Toronto in 2003, September, and it's been quite a journey trying to establish connection in community. It's been a difficult journey. It depends on what your intentions are and how you fit in the community. But we can get into that a little bit later, more in detail, as we go through some of the conversations that we'll cover in the film today. Wabanos Lane. There's actually two lanes, Wabanos Lane and Cheechak Lane, that have pretty significance to the Church Street community, which is just adjacent to Church Street, north of Wellesley, and just east of Yonge Street. These two particular lanes hold significance simply because these lanes were named after two particular Indigenous chiefs. And this significance really boils down to the selling of the city of Toronto by these two individuals. There's a lot of controversy as to the legitimacy of that and the selling of, because these are terms that typically were not used within Indigenous culture and interactions, simply because we don't own the land. And so this perhaps might be a term that was introduced or adopted or perhaps encouraged to be used from the powers that may be to these two particular chiefs. But nevertheless, these two chiefs, it is believed in history that, I believe in 1850, I believe it was, or 1860, thereabouts, the selling of the territory and the land to the city of Toronto, as what we know today. Sandhill burials are quite a disturbing detail in history that I think most people are not familiar with. And as far as I'm concerned as well, myself, I was quite surprised, simply because I'm not from this territory. This is not Indigenous to my territory. And so as a guest from the north residing in the city of Toronto, when I became aware of these types of details of the Sandhill burials, it was quite disturbing. It is believed that in the geographical region of Yonge Street, parallel to Church Street, north of Wellesley, around Wabanos Lane, south of Isabella, in that block, that there was a discovery of well over 500 Indigenous burials. And as history is to be told, the development of that area by contractors and whatnot, and this is the disturbing part. I still get very disturbed when I hear this or speak about it, is the crushing of the skeletons to create a mortar to help build the foundations of what we know, the historical buildings that we see on Yonge Street in that particular area. And so that is a detail in history that is very difficult to process, especially as an Indigenous person, but as a citizen of Toronto and of the area. It's something that literally the structures of a number of these buildings, what are now historical buildings, were literally built on the backs or the skeletons of Indigenous peoples. And so I think it's really important that we reflect on that. We understand that. The Mississaugas of credit are the people who have traditionally called this territory home. there have been understandings of some of the burials of the skeletons have been returned to that territory for proper burial and ceremony. But I think we need to be aware of that history and be mindful and be sensitive of that reality that took place then. It's something that I and many people are not aware of. There is what we know today as the Native Canadian Centre of Toronto, which is situated at Bloor and Spadina Road, 16th Spadina Road. But they were never always situated there. They actually started out in 1962, just up the street here on Church Street, just south, actually on the corner of Isabella and Church Street, is where the Canadian Indian Centre was incorporated in 1962, and that's where it started. That was new to me. I also knew that it also had a satellite office over on Gerrard and Greenwood area. In fact, I think the original sign is still there. But they incorporated it in 1962, and they were situated in Isabella and Church Street. And that's really important to mention because if most people in society and in Toronto, for example, are not familiar with the Friendship Center movement. And the Friendship Center movement started, well, in this case, 1962 for this location. It was the first center for Indigenous people in urban settings across Canada for urban Indigenous folks to congregate and come together to learn culture and language and ceremonies and just be amongst one another. Because in and around that time, it was illegal for Indigenous people to have what they refer to as unlawful meetings, and charges and incarcerations would be issued for those type of unlawful meetings. And so to have a center like that be available for urban Indigenous folks to establish community and be amongst one another was very key. And so that was in 1962. I believe from 1962 to 1966, it was situated at that location, and then they relocated to the present location of 16th Spadina Road, which continues to do the fabulous work that they do for the Indigenous urban setting community. I've done several years of traditional cultural work for that center. They do anything from teaching language in various different nations of languages to ceremonies and cultural work and whatnot. So, and everybody who comes to the city of Toronto at some point makes their way there to connect to community. The 519, first of all, thank you to the 519 and all the fabulous work that they do at the 519. They provide so much services for our LGBTQ plus community. So hats off to the team over there. You'll notice at the 519 there is a mural. And on the mural on the side of the building there is an image of various different images, but one in particular that I really connected with was the Indigenous image of what appears to be a warrior. And that image depicts a term that we have in the Indigenous community as two-spiritedness. And for those who are not familiar with the term two-spirited, it is the ability for an individual to possess both male and female spiritual essences. And so when we see that, representation is everything for many of us. And if you're an Indigenous person coming to the city of Toronto who happens to be under the LGBTQ plus community and you see that image, you feel a sense of comfort, connection, that perhaps this is now perhaps another part of my home. There is a group, a friend of mine, personal friend of mine, Bella. Bella is a part of a drum group that provides hand drum singing and drumming at the 519 Parquet. And so you'll hear periodically, weekly sometimes, hand drumming songs. I believe Sarah Louie is also part of that. There's a number of people in the community who are Indigenous who come out and just make that connection to community to provide that spiritual, I don't know, that spiritual connection to those who wish to be a part of it, which is nice because when you're in the city of Toronto, you typically wouldn't hear in such open spaces hand drumming. And so when you hear that, and as we were walking on our initial walking tour, it just so happened that that was happening at that same time, and it was just nice to see that community members making connections with other community members and providing that type of spiritual and cultural guidance. You know, I know many young folks that come from other locations across Canada, whether it's First Nations or rural locations. At some point, when they arrive in Toronto, they make their way obviously to the Church Street community, and to see murals like that, to see hand drumming ceremonies occurring in open spaces like that, again allows community to feel connected, and it's a beautiful thing, and I think we see more and more of that nowadays. For myself, I personally don't identify as two-spirited. And I think that's a term that society is misunderstanding and applying to all Indigenous folks who are under the LGBTQ plus community, that if you are Indigenous, lesbian or gay, bi, trans, or whatnot, that you are two-spirited. And that would not be an accurate statement. It's important that we have conversations with our community members and asking them how they identify, and giving them that opportunity to share their voice and their teachings on how they wish to identify. And being two-spirited is just another conversation that allows an individual to share based on their own comfort level and their own understandings and their own teachings of who they are. There is a generalization or a misunderstanding that anyone who is Indigenous is two-spirited based on, and this is my thought on this, is that they're basing it on one's sexual orientation. And the buzzer here is one's spiritual orientation. Now, there are going to be various different interpretations and understandings, even within my community, what that term means. This is why it's important to ask the questions to the individual. What is your definition of two-spirited? And do you identify as two-spirited? What does that mean? What does that look like? And for myself, I identify as an Indigenous gay male. But the territory that I come from, I actually identify under a term called Ejumanajejig, which is people of the purple light. Purple in our spiritual understandings and our customs and our practices speaks to where our spirit sits. Spirit is purple. It's a purple hue. We all have purple. And those who are of that light, that has that ability to see spiritually male and female realms, can make that connection with that term. Now, that particular term, Ejumanajejig, is a term that was offered to me, given to me specifically from my elder in our Swan Lodge, used for that sole purpose. And so I want to caution anyone out there that we mustn't just generalize, we mustn't just assume that it is okay to borrow terms and assume that we'll adopt those terms as our own. There's a lot of harm and danger that can go with that. So we need to be very mindful of that. So Ejumanajejig is a term that is used for my identity, but for some in the Indigenous community may identify as two-spirited, or a term that is used in their territory, in their language, under their dialect. So it can be very complicated, but again, at the end of the day, it's just important to have a simple conversation as to how do you identify. Oh my goodness, Zelda's. No longer in the location where it was, but Zelda's was a fun happening place that, especially if you're from out of town, you would make your way there for, say, a Friday or Saturday night to have dinner and to watch a drag show and just to be in community. It was almost like the starting point of your evening out. I know for myself, when I used to live out of town and I would come to Toronto, that was the place, make reservations to have dinner there. Because, you know, when you're from a northern community or any community outside of Toronto and you don't have these type of spaces, to be able to just allow yourself to be and enjoy yourself, Zelda's was that place. It was a very, very fun atmosphere. And it was, as I mentioned, it's no longer there. At one point, it actually was relocated to Yonge Street, which didn't really fly for a very long period. I think that Church Street and Zelda's, I think the Church Street community lost a pretty important component of our community when Zelda's shut down on Church Street, which is unfortunate because it allowed gay, lesbians, bisexuals, trans, all of our community to come together and dine and have fun together. We don't typically see that nowadays, right? And it's unfortunate because we talk about inclusivity and equality, and yet we're so separated from one another. And Zelda's was that space that encouraged us, at least in my mind, it encouraged us to be together and be in a space, a safe space to just allow yourself to be. And it doesn't exist anymore, and that's unfortunate. The steps. You know, right now we have the TD Bank located there. I believe there is a dry cleaning store there. And I believe at one point Ginger's used to be located there. It's now closed. But before they brought those establishments closer to the street sidewalk, it used to be an open walkway area. And it used to be a space where people would congregate, cruise. It was a cruising space. I never liked it, simply because when you would walk by, you would have people literally either meowing at you or woofing at you. And I found that to be so disturbing, especially coming from up north, and that's something that you typically wouldn't be accustomed to. And then somebody's woofing you or meowing at you. And for me, I would turn around like, what is that? Right? But that was the tone of how you perhaps interacted or showed interest in someone walking by or to give a compliment. I get it, but at the time, being so very, very new to the city and into the gay culture, it was very odd. But it was also a place that you kind of just made connections and you know, I know many people who have met their partners in that area, right? Who have dated people because of that space that they had interacted with. Now we have a coffee store a coffee establishment that's in that corner, and that is the Now location that kind of has replaced the steps in my mind. When we look at Church Street, especially when we look at north of Church Street, or north of Wellesley on Church Street, you'll notice there's a dip into the, just by the 519 into the street. And that dip is believed to be as a result of the flowing of the original river that would flow from, say, Isabella, Church Street, all the way down to Carlton and Church Street, up to what we now know as the Toronto Maple Leafs Loblaws building. And that whole area, all the way down Church Street, was very important to Indigenous people, because Indigenous folks always, we always did ceremonies and always buried our deceased around waterways and riverways. Hence why it is believed that the burial sites of the Sandhill burial sites was so near the water. Right? And so that doesn't sound surprising that was that discovery by a river system. But the point I'm trying to make, though, is that on Church Street, there is a river system that existed that ended around Carlton and Church, and it was a marshland that for most people would considered to be useless land in the sense that it didn't really have much purpose. But for Indigenous folks, that was a place that had such abundance of medicine. Marshlands and swampy lands are a plethora of medicines that exist. And it was also believed that there was a number of birds, extinct birds, that really were found in abundance in that area that no longer exists, so much so that it would almost create a dimming of the sunlight because there was so much birds in that area. Now it's replaced with, obviously, the Maple Leaf Gardens and the establishments in that area. But I think it's important that we understand, though, that when we look at history, we look at what Church Street is all about. There are so many different aspects of our community that have an Indigenous historical connection to it. And for me, one of the biggest important pieces is that waterway. And that waterway spoke so much about how Indigenous people being connected to the land and the water, and why they were here at that time, holds so much significance. And so it's important that we are aware of that. Many people don't know that there was a river system here. Many people don't know that there was a marshland over there. There's just so much history here. I mean, we're going through bits and pieces of information in history, but there is so much more that exists. And I encourage everyone who is watching this video to educate yourself, to have connection to community, to make those connections to the key individuals within the Indigenous community, to tell the stories of the history of this territory. There's so much more riches that we are speaking about that people have no clue about. Oh, this particular beaded medallion was made by my mother. Um, I came out in court. I was applying for child custody, and my lawyer at the time thought I was already out and put in the court deposition papers that I was an out gay male. And that was not the case. And so I say that only because I never had the conversation with my mother about being out at that time. Of course, she's aware of it now, but at the time when she was brought that information by me, I sat with her, I spoke to her about it. We had a very emotional moment about my coming out. And in our belief systems, the rainbow color system means so many different things to many different people, especially our community, the gay community. And in our community of the Indigenous community, it represents so much more in terms of strength, connection, power, grounding, the understanding of the self from a spiritual place. And so my mother, when she was aware that I was gay, she started to make a lot of her beaded items with rainbow colors. Not to make it sound like it was a form of tokenism. Oh, my son is gay, so I'm going to make this. It wasn't that. It was more from a spiritual place to give that sense of acknowledgement of he is gay, but he is much more than that from a spiritual place. And so she made this particular item, and she would wear it. She would wear it, and she would tell the story of her son, who is gay, and how my connection to my community of the LGBT, my connection to my community up north, my connection to my spiritual community is a very strong foundation of who I am. And so that leads into a final piece about a term that I had used on the walk, which was termed as a breeder. When I came out in court, I was gaining custody for my daughter at the time. And when I first came to Toronto, I thought it would be a very embracing experience, right? That the whole gay community would just welcome me in. And I didn't receive that type of welcome. It's either you are a partier into the drug scene, the drinking scene, the nightclub scene. There's so many different gradients within our community. And I spoke about this, of us speaking about equality and diversity, but we're so separate from one another that we isolate each other. Because if you don't look a certain way, you belong here. If you're not a muscle guy, if you're not a bear, or if you're not this or that, or butch or masculine, or whatever the case is, you belong elsewhere. We don't include everyone together, which is very unfortunate. And so I was termed an identity then as a breeder. And I didn't understand what that meant. Again, I thought it was going to be I was going to be embraced in the community. And these guys said, well, you're not really gay, but you're not really straight. You have a child, so you're a breeder, so you belong over there, not with us. And I felt that to be such a disempowering experience that it turned me off from ever wanting to be associated with the gay community. And it took a number of years to feel a sense of connection to the community. Ironically, doing the walk after all these years was the very first time that it allowed me to feel connected to community, to tell the story of our tertiary community through an Indigenous lens. And I was too busy raising my child as a single parent, right? I didn't have time or the luxury to go out and this is not a disrespect or put down to anybody who does engage in partying and the nightlife, and that's not what this conversation is about. The point is that we need to start including each other in every aspect of our community. We need to start lifting our community members up as opposed to pushing them down and separating them. How can we learn to build strong communities and unite if we're constantly being laterally violent with one another? We need to start embracing, acknowledging the differences, but celebrate each other. And I think years thereafter, being coined the term breeder, I know exactly who I am. It doesn't bother me anymore, that term. I've done the work. I'm now a part of community. And this is the community that I associate with. This is the community that I connect with. And we have so much work in the community to do. And I think this kind of video and others who are part of this production doing their video stories will tell the stories of our community in its entirety.